Good afternoon. I'm Bill Harris, the director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, and I'm very happy to have a program today about a really exciting project that we've undertaken here with a lot of help from a lot of different people. It's an animated film, We Dare Not Fail, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. And today we have Dean Temple, the director, Julian Dwyer, the illustrator, and Tony Melson, the narrator. We're going to talk about the process of putting together an animated film of this type. We'd like to thank the New York Community Trust, the Roosevelt Institute, and the National Archives for helping us to make these types of films possible. So so let's bring the folks on and let's start a conversation about the Tuskegee Airmen and how they've been captured. I apologize. First, we're actually going to show the film. That seems like the most important part of this. So let's watch it. It's about 7 minutes long, and then we'll have a conversation.
In 1925, the Army War College releases a report called The Use of Negro Manpower in War.
They came to the conclusion that Negroes are a subspecies of the human family and do not have the smarts, courage, and the integrity to be officers and certainly not pilots.
Benjamin O. Davis Jr. enters West Point in 1932 as its only African-American cadet.
For the 4 years that he attended, not one of his fellow students spoke to him.
Isolated and addressed only in the line of duty, Davis graduates in the top 15% of his class. He requests assignment to the Army Air Corps, but they do not train black soldiers to be pilots. With World War II approaching, the U.S. military remains segregated, restricting black soldiers to service jobs.
Most of America had doubts and a serious question about my capacity and my capability, based purely on my race.
We urge the President to use his broad powers to stop such grossly unfair policy. Walter White.
The settlement of vexing racial problems cannot be permitted to complicate the tremendous task of the War Department and thereby jeopardize discipline and morale. General George Marshall.
President Franklin Roosevelt faces a tight re-election race in 1940. Union leader A. Philip Randolph and the NAACP's Walter White meet with FDR that September because the black vote becomes pivotal. Not long after, the administration announces the Army will train black pilots for the first time. The Army Air Corps selects the Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, to train black pilots. Eleanor Roosevelt, in Alabama for a related event, visits the institute.
She said, I've heard that Negroes can't fly, but I see you seem to be doing it around here.
Mrs. Roosevelt takes a flight with Chief Alfred Anderson, now known as the father of black aviation. Their photo will be seen nationwide. 4 months later, Benjamin Davis leads the first class of Tuskegee Airmen to graduate, eventually becoming commander of the all-black 99th Squadron. They deployed in North Africa in April 1943. For every bomber shot down in World War II, the Allied forces might lose 10 or 11 men. General Nathan Twining impresses upon now Colonel Benjamin Davis the critical importance of fighter plane escorts.
Colonel Davis said, your mission is to protect those bombers. Stay with them. Don't allow yourself to be drawn off by a decoy.
Under Davis's command, the all-black 332nd Fighter Group earns the name Red Tail Angels, becomes the most effective escort group in the 15th Air Force, and white bomber pilots start requesting them by name. But while the Tuskegee Airmen in Europe fight Hitler, in the United States, they fight Jim Crow. Colonel Robert Selway commands the 477th, the first black bombardment group, on a base with both black and white officers. He segregates them even though Army regulations prohibit this.
He came up with an idea that he'd separate them by classifying all of the white officers on the base as instructors, all of the black officers, 453 of them, as trainees.
In early April 1945, black officers organize a nonviolent protest, entering an officers' club restricted to instructors. Selway closes the club in response, making his segregation policy a base regulation and commanding every officer sign it.
He decided he was going to have us read a statement, sign it, and say we're going to obey it. I knew before I got there what I was going to do about it.
Selway orders the arrest of 101 black officers for refusing to sign.
If you do that in wartime, that's treason. You could be shot to death by firing squad.
Black press coverage embarrasses the War Department, leading General George Marshall to order the release of the 101 men on April 23rd. But Major General Frank Hunter, who enacted many of the segregationist policies against the 477th, adds letters of reprimand to each officer's permanent record.
After I'd been in the military about a week, I was going to stay for 30 years. I certainly didn't want to get out, but that letter.
Colonel Benjamin Davis replaces Colonel Selway, becoming the first African-American stateside-based commander in U.S. history. Morale improves, but the war ends before the 477th deploys.
We went into combat as a double V team. We said victory over Nazism and fascism in Europe and victory over racism in America.
3 years after the war ends, President Harry Truman orders the military to desegregate. The Air Force is the first branch to do so. But it's not for 50 years that Tuskegee Airmen will have Major General Hunter's letters of reprimand removed. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awards General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. his 4th star.
We dared not fail. We knew that we had the future of our people, not just ourselves, riding on our shoulders. And I dare say every one of us felt that way.
Now it's time to bring in our filmmakers and let's talk about how a project like this comes together, about how different people from different areas of a production work together, and what's driving the end product, what makes it into the final thing that you see on the screen. And the director, Dean Temple, is the one who has to take those of us who are working from an editorial perspective and work with an illustrator, and of course with a narrator. That all of those work together. There's not one starting point and one ending point in a way. It's all working together. Talk to us about that, Dean.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's not an ending point. I even watching it just now, I'm like, oh gosh, I should fix that one thing. But I think what happens with a project like this, first of all, in this case, of course, we were approached by FDR to produce an animated film, and this is the second one in a series. We had done one last year on Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's part of what FDR is kind of compiling as a series of educational animated films for the classroom. And to start a process like this, though, you really kind of have to start in the history. And the first thing we started with was Todd Moy's book, Freedom Flyers. And Todd was, of course, very helpful during this process. It's an excellent book. We also, because FDR had previous footage of the Tuskegee Airmen from an earlier project, Red Tail Angels, which was created by Cara DeVito. She had done 40 hours of interviews, which we poured through to gather, well, first of all, to really learn from the perspective of the Tuskegee Airmen, but also to pull what we could from that's in this film. All of the clips that you hear from actual Tuskegee Airmen and Mildred Hemmons Carter is from those interviews that were conducted early on.
And Dean, I think that's an interesting point about the 40 hours, because those of us in the profession that we're in at the library, archivists, curators, we're used to a large amount of material and helping people to navigate it. But for a 7-minute film, it's hard enough for a documentary feature that's 2 hours long. But for an animated film of 7 minutes, that's a complicated undertaking.
You know, for something like that, you know that you can work with sound bites, and so you're listening for sound bites as you're scouring through all of the content. As I go through content, I always clip everything I think is interesting, and set it aside for later, so that you can go back and listen to it again and see what works within the context of the story you're telling.
Well, that's a good point. The story that you're telling, and framing that story as well. And as we've talked about previously, certainly it's within the context of the Roosevelts in World War II. But that's not, our approach wasn't to center the story in that, but in the actual people who were flying, the Tuskegee Airmen and the conflicts that they faced and the challenges.
Well, I think any project that we do for the FDR Library has to be relevant to FDR or Eleanor or both. But in this case, we did want to make sure that the story stayed focused on the Tuskegee Airmen. And there's two stems of stories there that are really important. The one of the men who made it to Europe and fought against fascism, and the ones who stayed in the United States and fought for their rights here, which was important. Once we sort of get a lot of that stuff figured out, we went looking for an illustrator, and we're very lucky to find Julian, who has been utterly critical in this project on every level, not just as an illustrator. Every single thing I wrote, I was like, "Hey, Julian, talk to me about this."
And Julian, just to build on that first too, the difference between this is an animated film, you're an illustrator who helped, was central to making it possible. So also, I think that's an interesting distinction as you're looking at things historically. You're looking at these actual people, trying to capture a story visually, knowing that it will also be an animated feature as well.
Yeah, there was no pressure at all.
And a timeline, right? And always a timeline.
I think I probably stressed Dean and Alex out with a timeline a lot more than I intended that way. But it was challenging, but it was a real honor to work on this and try and do the men justice. That was a lot of pressure on myself, self-imposed pressure. To do this right, because it was so important to me personally to do it right. So,
I could tell when Julian was feeling pressure, and so what we started doing, and I think this is something that comes out of COVID. We started co-working in a Zoom meeting, so we would sit in a Zoom meeting together with the camera off and the sound off, and just work, and occasionally somebody would have a question for the other.
Well, that's interesting from the perspective too of as a script comes together. When is the illustrator? When does that come into play? Right? At what point do you bring the person who's going to be? Because this is a visual story as well as a linear, oral, archivally based story.
Right.
So,
well, for the script, there were a couple of things that a couple of things we wanted to go through before we start illustrating anything, because Julian shouldn't be doing work he doesn't need to do just as we're experimenting with what the story is going to be. So early on in the process, I was working with Dan Hallman, and I'll show his book as well, the Tuskegee Airmen Chronology, although he's written others on the Tuskegee Airmen. He's retired now, but he was the official Air Force historian. Dan was the consulting historian on this project who let me know whenever I was adding something to the script that wasn't based in fact. And then we also worked with Elisa Quitney, who is a writer and an editor. It was terrific. She has written for Marvel, but she also was an editor at DC. She was an assistant editor on The Sandman, really understands story well. And so between the two of them and the editorial team at FDR, we worked through a lot of iterations of the script till we got it someplace where we were comfortable. Then Julian and I can sit down and start storyboarding and see what doesn't work in the script in terms of visual storytelling. And a lot of that was in Julian's court. So I'll let him talk about that a little bit in terms of approach to storyboard, because he was instrumental in those early points of helping, how this was going to work visually.
Well, I mean, first off, this is the first time I'd ever done anything in this scope. So it was totally new to me. So I mean, we started up. I saw the script. We discussed some key points of it and talked about angles and how we want to portray mood was important, because I like to, my own personal work, I like to try and capture emotions of the subjects or atmosphere as much as possible. So, we narrowed it down to a couple of things, a couple of ideas, what angle we want to try and portray this at, over the shoulder, close up, that kind of stuff, standard kind of stuff. And then went to some sketches. We looked at the sketches, ran it through with Dean and Alex, and I guess they ran it through to the FDR, the library guys. And then we started going into final illustration, which was also very different, because I'm accustomed to working on a sheet of paper and having everything on one layer. And this time I had to go all digital. And, Dean walked me through what was necessary, which was a whole different world and required a whole lot more work preparing this layer than anticipated. So it was all new, but it was really a lot of fun. And fun discovering the technology and trying to see how I can make it work and still be true to myself in the process.
Thinking too about the topic, what did you consult? Did you look at images? Were you concerned? How concerned were you about sort of representing things, people, so they really looked like who the pictures show them to be, or was it that? But it's more than that.
It was, you want to look your subjects to look like the real people, but at the same time, I like the expressionistic part of it more. I really want to capture a mood and feel. Paramount to the actual physical representation of the people. Although, for some, it's important that FDR looks like FDR. Okay, it's important that Eleanor looks like Eleanor, and General Davis looks like who he is. You can't go around that. But like crowd scenes, we want to capture mood, and we want to, we don't want to get into specifics. At least I didn't want to. It was more of working with shapes and creating a feel of the artwork of that time, kind of, that I was really inspired by. I really like expressionistic artwork and abstract artwork. So I try to, even though everything I do is representational, I try to get as much of that texture and feel into it as much as possible, if that makes sense.
It does. And Dean, then both of you, in terms of storyboarding, talk a little about what that even means. You talk about shots. It's like you are making a film. Just because it's animated doesn't mean that you don't have shots, the way you compose the frame.
Right. Well, when you're shooting a scene in a film, the audience needs to understand where they are and what everybody's relative position is one to another. So like when Julian's mentioning it over the shoulder shot, let's for example, the scene with FDR, Walter White, and Philip Randolph. The first shot of that shows FDR at his desk between the shoulder shot of Randolph and White, so that when it reverses, the room context makes sense for the viewer. And so you look at it from that context. And then in terms of and we will get to you, Tony. Sorry, I know. Narration kind of comes last in the process.
We're not forgetting you, Tony. Don't worry.
No, my mom just sent me a text message that popped up on my phone, and so.
Is she looking for how to find to this show to watch it?
No, she actually watched it. She's like, "Oh, you're so handsome, just sitting there," and that made me smile. So.
Hi, Tony's mom. But the other thing that's kind of interesting as we're talking about this, because when you're talking about over the shoulders, you're specifically speaking about layers. And you've got the layer of the people in the foreground and then everything that's happening in the background. Julian, who's accustomed to doing things in single dimension on a piece of paper, I was asking him to do these as separate layers so that I can manipulate those layers in an animation. When the planes that are flying in the film and things like that, the reason I can manipulate those is because the planes stand by themselves and everything else stands independent of that. So I have the capacity to use the main thing that Julian drew as a keyframe, and then to create all of the other moving frames around that way. And last year working with Richard was incredible because he's an incredible artist, but we were getting everything from him on paper. Working with Julian this year, I had a lot more flexibility because we were working with everything digitally and with these multiple manipulatable layers.
So that back and forth, then we've got our script. You're deciding or thinking about and talking about how you want to frame a shot. Then you're in conversation with Julian about, and he may have a view that no, it could look really more dramatic like this. Is that the type of interaction that's occurring?
I'm going to defer to Julian. I will say if Julian had a visual suggestion, I tended to say yes.
I mean, we shot ideas back and forth, Dean. I mean,
of course.
If I had an idea for something and it wasn't going to be it doesn't work in the timeline in the continuity thing, and then it's got to go. It could be a nice idea, but if it doesn't work for the film, it's got to go.
It was Julian's suggestion that we have the Indiana Jones sequence in the middle there when they go from Tuskegee to North Africa.
Well, that was good because it does very visually though tell you something that could be just unnecessarily cumbersome from a it could just be really boring, and it actually people respond to that. They do respond to that. But since we mentioned Tony and as a narrator, let's bring him into this too, because narration isn't as simple as just reading words on a page. And I don't know that people appreciate what goes into capturing the right tone or where you're emphasizing the words and how that relates to what's on screen.
Yeah, well, first, this is my very first, my inaugural debut, voiceover gig. So I'm very grateful to Dean for bringing me on. So let's just say, yes, sitting in the booth, I think for like the first, 15 minutes was pretty much just, me trying to get the rhythm of like how to speak, to read it in a conversational way. And also, I come from the theater where everything is, big and loud and like in your face. And, when you got a mic like right here, everything has to be kind of pulled back. So there's a lot of that. And then, eventually, like once and I was nervous too, like, oh God, like, I hope he's not like, oh, I chose the wrong person. So there's a lot of that going on. Like any actor, you're always like in your head. And there's other things too. Like as I was watching it, I was just remembering Benjamin O. Davis. There's just like, because his name is, the O is like an initial, but when I'm saying Benjamin O. Davis, it could sound like he's Irish. So so we spent a lot of time on that. I learned new words like plosives, syllables, stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, you have to make it sound, inviting and warm and conversational. Hi. Now we're talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. So it was definitely a really fun experience, and
but there's an authority. The narrator brings a gravitas to it, though. There's an authority that comes with being the narrator.
Yes, I bring gravitas everywhere I go with me. But yes, no, I mean, obviously, like, I'll think back to I think we mentioned Ken Burns when we were working, and I was trying to think about, because I've watched, the Civil War and all of his documentaries, so I was trying to conjure some of that Ken Burns-esque delivery on some of the stuff, and like, oh, how would Ken Burns say this? In his documentary about the Tuskegee Airmen, how would he say this phrase? And just kind of, try to add my own voice into it, obviously, but also make it so that it is like relatable, approachable, and I sound like someone that you want to listen to and take seriously.
And Dean, and when we think about the narration over the images, along with the script, and your job as the director, there's a pacing question too, isn't there? How does actually hearing the narration over how does it work to get to the point where you feel comfortable that the final narration lays in? What's occurring there as you look at a rough cut on it?
Well, you're building an audio landscape. I mean, you're trying to create an entire atmosphere around a film from beginning to end, and so you figure out what you want the pacing of the narration to be. And in this case, you've got Tony, and then with the interspersed original interviews with the Tuskegee Airmen, you want to balance those so that it feels like it's moving at a comfortable pace, so that it's not rushed, so that so it has time to breathe, but it also doesn't start feeling like it's dragging. And then you figure out, you start figuring out what your sound effects are going to be, because a film like this can have sound effects, and that's kind of fun to play with. It just creates a slightly more alive landscape for people as they listen to it. And then you try to find music that works for individual scenes. And in a film like this, we just go ahead and put music underneath the entire thing, because I feel like it gives it a layer of support. This is not a dramatic film. You don't need these quiet moments for conversations between people. This is a storytelling, but historical documentary storytelling that I feel like music adds something to that. It just scene. So
it is essential. You're correct, because we would listen. We would see it without any music, or you hear it in an entirely different way.
For something like this, it can feel unfinished, and kind of like your soundtrack with the fire alarm.
That's not in Rhinebeck. I'm assuming that's somewhere very urban at this point, like New York City. Oh, okay. We're going to make that assumption here. So in thinking about mood, that Julian, you spoke of mood, and that you pick a color palette, and there's a conversation certainly, because it's part of this process that's not being that I'm not speaking about very much. Is the library is sitting here, and we are discussing and debating in a biweekly editorial meeting, and we're sort of both reacting to things and also advocating for things. So again, there's the mood question of when you look at an image and the colors you choose, and the director's role in moderating between those of us who may approach it from a very historical perspective and those who are approaching it from a visual perspective. Yeah, Julian.
Well, I mean, the challenge for this project for me, aside from it just me being a novice to this whole process and doing it, is that the palette was actually pretty monochromatic in many ways. I mean, it's you're dealing with army, and there's only certain types of colors using uniforms and so forth. So the little bit of color that, of expressionism that you're trying to use are in the main characters, and trying to just add some humanness to them so they don't come off as being just figures in the story. They're actually humans, and everyone has their own special color to make them human. That's all I can say is.
Yeah.
So it's the palette situation was challenging because it's I'm pretty limited. Self-imposed, by the way, because Dean gave me a lot of creative freedom. So it was a matter of, well, we have to make this look a certain way to add to this mood. The art, the men walking towards the officers' club. We want to make all mute the colors in the background and the uniforms, but we want to make their faces stand out. At least that was my intent. So those are the tricks that I have to work with, and it requires multiple attempts sometimes, but hopefully it worked.
Dean, go ahead.
Well, no, and another thing I want to point out, Julian, that we talked about a little bit, and that you manifested brilliantly, is the emotional state of the people, and we've talked a lot about the fact that these soldiers couldn't react to situations that were negatively impacting them, because if they did, then they would be punished for that. And how do you portray that in an illustrated character on screen? How do you portray those layers of emotion, those layers of humanity in an illustrated character on scene? So, Julian, how did you do that?
It's a difficult question. Thanks. It's hard to express. I mean, I like to, for certain scenes, for instance, the officer that was the janitor that was sweeping the floor. I wanted to keep it. Hate to use a musical analogy, but it's very jazzy. I mean, there's a lot of blues in here. There's a lot of there's a somberness to that scene. So I have to focus on his eyes or the shadows around the eyes, and to show his frustration and maybe his resentment at being in a situation that he's in when he knows he's due for something better, and also have the viewer look at that and feel the same kind of thing through use of color. And again, very challenging because I don't normally work with a lot of color in my own personal work. So it's all that stuff was very explorative for me, and it was just a matter of using little bursts of colors and highlights in areas just to make the emotion come through.
That's an interesting point too, and it makes me think of something Tony said also about he's an actor. This is his first voiceover narrator role, and your art doesn't usually isn't usually in this style. So this is these are new opportunities or a different approach than what you usually have done. So what sort of challenge? Tony sort of spoke to this, but again, I would ask, just were there challenges in thinking about it less than your own work than as part of a bigger whole?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I think Tony also. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely Tony too.
Well, for me, the challenge was doing something that was, there's kind of an evolution from beginning through end too, with things tightening up towards the end and becoming more representational. But it was working loosely, starting to, it was kind of working in a way that I wasn't working in at the time. And going back to a style that I started out with, and then using that information to then propel the story forward. So it was very difficult for me at times. I won't lie, because I was I had to think differently to get the drawings to work. And but it was also, all those things are great learning experiences and part of the fun. I love the process. I always love processes, whether it's in graphic design or illustration. So this all, that challenge just made it all the more exciting for me.
And Tony, before I get to you, it makes me think we're the same. I'm thinking about our own staff is thinking visually is not a way that we, until we began this series of animated films, a way that we often react to the word on the page, but we also have to sort of transition the way we think, so that there are pictures also telling the story, not just the words. And then Tony, of course, you from an acting background, you're used to it maybe not being your words, but at the same time, it's a different kind of, as you said, acting and narration than it would be on the stage.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a great challenge, and it's something for me that, as a performer, as an actor, I just love every opportunity I have to be able to perform, to do my craft, and this is just another part of my skill set that I need to develop and work on. And I constantly, I get other voiceover auditions come my way, and I'm actually using the stuff that I learned in the studio working with Dean and carrying that forward, because everyone has to have that first opportunity that kind of gets the ball rolling, so that you have that, and it turned out great. And when I was listening to it, I was like, wow, sounds good. So it's great to have it to help put it on my reel. So hopefully there'll be other opportunities for me to get my voice out there and do this kind of work, or do another one of these projects with Dean. Who knows what goes on, but yeah, it's great. It's just you got to be multifaceted. You got to be able to do all the things as an artist and really stretch yourself.
It's fascinating to me because of your role, because the conversation is, and I would have never necessarily thought about that in my career, is what should the voice be? Is it a young voice? Is it an older voice? Is it a woman? Is it a man? That's a whole conversation. That's a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, and I think as as I was listening to it, you had the other gentleman. There was another gentleman who was there when we recorded, who did one of the other voices, and
Harold.
he has a much, we talk about gravitas. He's got that great deep.
He's got that.
Yeah, he's got that great voice, and that's not a part that you would probably, vocally cast me in, because it would sound, incongruous with what's, with the character. You know what I mean? So as a producer or a director, you have to know, okay, this is the kind of sound that I'm going for. You have, some people, we hear it all. We hear it all the time in animation and cartoons, right? A lot of times, child characters, boy child characters in cartoons are voiced by girls a lot of times, because their voices are high and beautiful sounding. So there's a lot of thought that goes into that, what the tone that you want to have. So, yeah, you just got to find your niche and know your voice.
And one of the reasons that we picked Tony for this project was because of the range of his voice. It does have a gravitas, not like Harold's voice, but it had a combination of youthful energy to it with a level of gravitas and seriousness and delivery. I've known Tony for years through New York theater, and he was one of the first people I thought of for this project, because first of all, I know him to be an excellent actor, and it was his energy. It's Tony's energy I thought really worked for the role, and it did. And he'll say he was nervous in the studio, and he was, but that was for working on the first scene, and then he settled into what we were doing, and from there it was very automatic. We moved through. We recorded this in under an hour.
An hour, yeah.
which is remarkable. But the word that comes to mind is collaboration. That these types of projects, anyone in a creative field, well, not everyone in a creative field. Certainly, as an artist, you're working maybe in a solitary fashion, but certainly this type of work is all about the collaboration. And I know that our team at the library certainly never realized how complex these types of undertakings are. And Dean's had to live with that a lot in the last few years. You all didn't have to, Tony and Julian, have to really confront the complexities.
So everybody watching knows I'm the sort of, I don't know if you would describe me as producer in residence for the Père Lorenz Center at the FDR Presidential Library. My partner, Alex Tuller, who I should mention, was the production manager on this film.
And she's great in bridging the worlds between the role that we have at the library and the role that you all play, and then Dean bringing in the others essential for this too.
And essential. Honestly, Dan Holman was amazing on this project, and I've never had anybody respond to me as quickly with so many notes as Dan Holman does. It was incredible. I would send him a script, and I mean, 10 minutes later, I would get detailed notes back from him about what was historically accurate, what was not, what would be a better way of saying something. Up until Monday, when I was still fixing history to make sure that this was historically accurate. And Elisa, who's been a friend of mine for years, who's a terrific writer, was amazing. She really, I think, helped me work it into a story that I hope is engaging.
Well, certainly from our perspective, to have those that input and the people who have conducted the research, who are the experts and who know this, we certainly understand and know parts of the story, but it's not like someone who does all the research. We may hold the records, but we're not an expert in every aspect of them. So that input is absolutely essential to the project.
This book of Dan's, just so you understand what it is, every one of these things you see is a date entry of an event that happened over the course of that stretch of time that is where the Tuskegee Airmen fit in. It's broken down by year and by date on events, so that I was able to sort of sort through timeline-wise that way, and always have reference to whether or not what I was doing was accurate, which was amazing. And of course, Todd understood this story extremely well from those two stems that we talked about and that we address in this film, the Europe, the double victory, which actually was, I believe, an idea from the Pittsburgh Courier. That was a promotional campaign of the Pittsburgh Couriers in the 40s. I could be wrong about that.
We're going to let you hang on that, and we'll correct that at any comments should it be incorrect. But I would like to thank all three of you. We had a comment here, and actually, here's a question. Did you consult any of the Tuskegee Airmen or their groups around the U.S.? What we were able to use, fortunately, are hours of oral histories that had been conducted among flyers and others associated with the Tuskegee Airmen. So that directly informed everything, really, about, to a large extent, structure even of the script and whose voice,
Absolutely.
Not a narrator's voice, or Dean, you can speak to that, a narrator's voice or someone who was directly engaged.
Right. And we did, I tried to, originally when I was going to do the film, I wanted to see if I could build it just from those videos, just from those interviews. But there was no way to pull together a coherent narrative from those. So it made more sense to use them in spots. And no, that's where all of this started, was with their words.
And I think now I'll say thank you for your participation. There's a comment, and I would have to ask our behind the scenes person. I don't know if it's possible. Someone said it would be interesting after the conversation to see the film once more. before we close. If that's possible, I think that would be a great idea. If not, it will be posted on our social media channels, links to it. So I will defer this since this was not planned. Is it possible to do that?
I think it posts to social media tomorrow.
Okay.
But if Cliff wants to run it again, and he can.
And I know I'm throwing it. I apologize. Now I've overstepped my bounds here as the library director and the moderator. As Panic has said it.
I think as the library director, you don't have any bounds.
Oh yeah. Excuse me. No. In all seriousness, I really want to thank everybody for being here today, because the collaborative nature of the work, the importance, frankly, of the story, the exceptional importance of this story, and the need to really not just to acknowledge it, but to as a public institution such as ours, to be a responsible party in telling this story and being a platform for the telling of this story, frankly. And so we encourage you to go to our social media channels to take a look at the film. It'll be up. It will be going forever, we hope. Oh, and Dean, anything?
Well, actually, if you want to watch the film again, if you reload wherever this is, you can play this video from the beginning, and then I don't suppose you have to watch our conversation a second time, but you could watch the film a second time.
Well, I would very much like to thank Dean and Julian and Tony for joining us today. We don't often do a program where we talk about how something comes together, but this is I think interesting to hear from you all, and I really appreciate you taking the time, and really appreciate your work on this, all of you, because we're really pleased with the outcome, and we really
thank you. Oh, I disappeared. Thank you, first of all, to FDR Library for making the project possible, but also to the New York Community Trust for
absolutely to the New York Community Trust
for funding,
and through our Pere Lawrence Film Center. So thank you. If you want to learn more, come to our website, go to our social media channels. You'll be looking at the film. You can probably find Julian's work out there if you want to look for it, and we'll look for you, Tony, either by voice or in vision.
Why don't you say your Instagram address, because you post your illustrations there?
Yes, you can find my stuff on Julian Loves Illustrating on Instagram.
Super.
So,
and I've got a website, www.tonymelson.com.
There you go.
You can hit me up there, see some stuff.
Wonderful. I'm glad we could get that out there. Thanks everybody and thanks for joining us, for those live online now and in the future who watch this program. So thanks everybody. And thanks for the FDR Live.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.